Okay. Well, we've done our test for the day. Everyone did good. Great. And now it's time to get on to the next chapter in our book. Just a reminder, I'm sure I'll talk about it at the end of the class as well. Next week we'll test on chapters 3 and 4. You do have your study guide for that, correct? I gave those last week, the study guide for 3 and 4.
I don't know. Let me make sure.
It was, I did it all on the same printout. I gave them when I handed back the, I came down there as y'all were leaving from out soon. Gave y'all's summaries for Minnesota practicality and also the
Maybe I put
chapter 3 and 4.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
So we'll test on that next week. Let's see here. Just while I'm thinking about it, we'll go ahead and I'll show y'all the tests. So we'll test on chapters 3 and 4. Now, I gave you the study guides. They were all on the same printout. But the test I'm going to hand to you separately. You'll do chapter 3, and then you'll do chapter 4. Let's see here. Zoom in a bit. All right. Okay. Alright, so I'll just kind of scroll through these. Let y'all get a look at the questions. Now, this one right here, in your textbook, there's multiple that are given there. Give reference verses, if possible, for bonus points. So whoever you choose, memorize the scripture reference as well. So you get some bonus points. Now, that's one thing I'll point out, too. With your bonus points, if you get over 100, then at the end of the year or semester when I do your grade, if you got bonus points, you got over 100, those bonus points will be applied to a test you might have made less than 100 on. So if you get 100, if you get 3 extra bonus points somewhere along the semester, Brother Anthony, that'll bump that 97 today right up to them. So there's an opportunity for you to make up for, even though that won't impact your 97, it's not like it's going to drop you down a grade point or anything like that. So. Describe the process of leavening the bread.
Was it with the yeast or whatever in it and then let it sit and then
Well, leavening, they would take a piece of the day-old bread, the
Oh,
day
yeah,
from
that's
before, and then add it. And then they bake that.
it's like that Amish bread that you just save from threw away. Like from
What was used to scoop the food out of the common pot at the evening meal? Or a piece of bread?
Oh, yeah. Hanging on a piece of bread? Oh, a piece of bread.
I think a piece of bread is what's in the textbook. But it probably wouldn't have been, too surprising in some households if they did use their hands. But their hands most definitely would have gotten in the
Bread.
yeah. Oh, y'all don't get to see all those questions.
Oh.
Uh-huh.
All right, and then this is test 4. This is food and mills. Okay, what could be produced by milk? There's quite a few there.
Butters and cheese.
That was meat cooked.
What's up, Mr. Joe?
Hello.
Morning.
Hey.
Got a couple of projects for our computer teams.
Okay.
I'm looking at it maybe at lunch break.
Okay.
This is 2 computers that hadn't been on in a couple of years. I took to the computer shop. Got the right power supplies for them and everything. Probably will end up having to download, update Windows and that kind of stuff on it. If you have time. You don't have to do it all today necessarily. I'm gonna be down there painting if y'all need me.
Okay.
Have fun.
I have my muse just working on me. I have this beautiful mural that I'm trying to put in there.
Can't wait to see it.
Yeah, I know.
All right, now there's multiple here that you could list that are listed in the textbook. So make sure to know at least 2. What vegetables were common throughout the Old Testament period? Now, one, I believe in this area where it's talking about, I want you to list vegetables that were common to them. Common, okay? There were some things that they only had in Egypt when they're in bondage, okay? Like the cucumbers and the melons and the other things that list there in the textbook.
Here
Right.
we're looking for beans and lentils, right?
That's it. Beans and lentils. That was common throughout the whole Old Testament period. Okay, not just those others that it lists there in that portion of the textbook. They only knew or had when they were in Egypt. Now, they probably would have eventually made their way through trade to Israel, but like I said, common throughout the Old Testament period. All right, and 2 types of fruit. There are multiple that are listed there. Why was hand washing important? What was the difference between poor and wealthy homes in regards to eating areas? What was the difference there?
A table?
Okay. The wealthy would have had tables and chairs. The poor, they would have had a rug and maybe some cushions. What was the Jewish diet generally, or was the Jewish diet generally good for health? Oh yeah.
What?
It was.
Jewish diet was good for health.
Oh, that's a yes or no question?
Why was water the main health concern?
Dirty.
Okay, it couldn't always be trusted to be clean, and yet a runoff from the roof could have gotten all kinds of bugs and all kinds of stuff from there. And it also mentions there in the text that that's why wine was a stable drink. What
What
was
do you mean by stable drink?
like it could be
the
trusted?
go-to drink.
Right.
Like it's what they use most.
Wow.
Drink.
What was believed to be more effective than medicine?
Prayer.
Very good. Prayer. And then there's a couple bonus questions there that y'all have to wait to see. All right. Online students, sorry for wasting 10 minutes of your time. I don't know if you could see what was up on the screen. But anyway, and sorry, I don't usually talk to you guys. It just doesn't cross my mind as I'm teaching. So if y'all have any questions, I don't know if you can comment on the video or maybe get word through Brother BJ. But don't be afraid to ask them, and we'll see about answering them during class. All right, on to the textbook. The Family, page 54. Page number 54. All right, the family. Family units in the West in the 20th century are called nuclear because they are small. Mother, father, and one or two children. Family units in the Old Testament times were large and included every member of the family, aunts, uncles, cousins, and servants. We would call them extended families. The leader of the family was the father, and the head of a group of families was the sheik. I'd know that. The head of a group of families was the sheik. Abraham and his heirs were sheiks, and on one occasion Abraham was able to raise 318 fighting men born in his household. That's pretty impressive. Mary and Joseph seem to have traveled in such a family when they went with Jesus to Jerusalem when he was 12 years old. They were traveling with relatives and friends. There were sufficient of them. Not to spot Jesus. That just seems weirdly worded to me. There were sufficient of them not to spot Jesus for a whole day, and Mary and Joseph were close enough in family ties to the extended family for them not to worry about it. Now, I do know what the author's talking about there. It just kind of seems awkwardly worded there at the beginning. All right, so they were traveling with their family, okay, to Jerusalem, and Jesus, it wouldn't have been uncommon for them to not see him for a day. He could have been riding a couple, trains back or a couple groups back with his cousins, hanging out with them and playing with them. So, they were traveling with family, so you trusted them, and when in reality he'd been left in Jerusalem, or he had stayed behind in Jerusalem. But that's always one of my, we're going to read it because that's one of my favorite accounts there. We'll look at that Genesis 14:14 reference first, where it's talking about Abraham raising his 318 fighting men from his own household. Genesis 14:14. If anybody gets there, you can go ahead and read it.
It says, and when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan.
Ooh. Like I said earlier, that's impressive. All right, and then the Luke 2:44 reference. Luke chapter 2, verse 44, it reads, "But they, supposing him to have been in the company, went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance." So they had traveled a day's journey away from Jerusalem, so that means it's going to take them a day to get back. All right, I imagine they probably went with a little more haste when they were leaving. But it wasn't uncommon for for that. You know, a lot of people, I know some have looked at that and been like, man, that's really irresponsible of Mary and Joseph. You know, it's the Son of God, and you know, you kind of just lost him. But it wasn't. You can't fault him because it was. You know, that's not uncommon. You know, the thought would have been, you know, the most likely thing is he's with another group of the family there. Everyone was trusted family, very close. And it says that when they found him not, they turned back again to Jerusalem seeking him. And it came to pass that after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that had heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. I imagine so. And he said unto them, How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? Don't you know that I must be about my Father's business? And they understood not the saying which he spake unto them. And then he left with them. And then at the end of that chapter it says, And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. So he grew wiser and he grew taller. But, I don't know, that's just one of I really like that. But, you know, it's like, I'm not saying Jesus wasn't perfect, but he, you know, mom and dad got real worried about him, you know, so I can, you know, take a little comfort knowing that I definitely did the same thing to my parents, though I wasn't doing what Jesus was doing, you know, debating in the temple with the doctors and the lawyers and the learned men of the day. I was causing and wreaking havoc in the neighborhood with my brother. And I'm not saying that, I mean it. we were terrors when we were growing up. Even had the cops called on us when I think we were 5 and 3. Vandalism. We had busted up an old boat that probably would have never floated, but still, yeah, it got the cops called on us. But anyway, and we were doing it right out in the open too. Anywho, do what Jesus would do, not Brother Christian. All right, the Father. The family was therefore a little kingdom that was ruled by the Father. He ruled over wife, children, grandchildren, and servants, everyone in the household. Children were brought up to accept this authority. Of course, Exodus 20:12, that's the 10 Commandments right there. And if they refused to accept it, thereby threatening the security of the family unit, they would be punished by death. Deuteronomy 21:18 through 21. On the death of the father, succession normally passed to his eldest son. Isaac was a special case. According to the family law practiced in Abraham's time, it was possible for a man to have a child by a secondary wife. Ishmael was born to Abraham and Hagar in this way. But if any child was born subsequently to the first wife, then that child, in this case Isaac, became head of the family. The same law was followed in Jacob's case. Rachel was always to be his first wife. Therefore, it was her eldest son, Joseph, who became Jacob's heir and was given the distinctive coat to show it. Genesis 37:3 through 4. Even though he was born long after his stepbrothers. Okay, any questions? Okay, that's the father. Now we'll look at the women. The role of a woman always appeared to be subservient to men. She kept out of sight when visitors were present, served the men in the family before eating herself, fetched the water, made the clothes, cooked the food, and walked while the men rode. That's Genesis 18:9. That's Sarah when she's in the tent when Abraham is receiving visitors. Even when Lot and his wife were in full flight from Sodom, she walked behind him. If Joseph had taken the position ascribed to him by many artists of walking beside a donkey that was carrying Mary, he would have been the laughingstock of his contemporaries. This is clearly reflected in Paul's writings, where in 1 Corinthians 11:3 says, "The head of the woman is man." Paul gives theological reasons for this. He tells Timothy that man was first created, but that woman was first tempted into breaking God's law in 1 Timothy 2:13 and 14. The traditional role did not mean that a woman was unloved or subject to disrespect when she fulfilled her role. She was the only one who could have children, and so important was this aspect of the family that if she was unfaithful to her husband and family, she paid with the death penalty. But when a husband was unfaithful to his wife with an unmarried girl, the girl became a member of his family. So important was motherhood that a woman's position was literally saved through childbirth. With her husband, the wife was looked upon as a representative of God to teach his laws. This was to grow into a kind of equality. In New Testament times, wives were still to submit to their husbands, but the love that the husbands were to have for their wives was itself to be a kind of submission, because he's submitting to God, all right, and being disrespectful and mistreating his wife would definitely not have been a submission to God. But this is true because when you love someone, you submit to what you know he or she wants by positively putting the other first. It was possible for a man to have more than one wife, but one wife seems to have been the ideal. I'd underline that. It was possible for a man to have more than one wife, but one wife seems to have been the ideal. The Jewish rabbis noted that God had produced only one wife for Adam, and Paul expected the church leaders of his day to conform to that pattern. The family unit itself was the key thing. Let's see. Let's look at some of these verse references here. Pull up my Bible on the TV. I want to look at that Genesis 19:26 reference there with Lot and his wife. Genesis 19, verse 26. Okay, yeah, this is where she becomes a pillar of salt. Verse 24, then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife, verse 26, looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Okay, so yeah, it talks about that she was walking behind him. Though where they kind of place it here in the paragraph, I guess it's kind of giving the idea that maybe she was walking and he was riding. Because that's what's being talked about there. And walk along the main road. Okay. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3. Now, sometimes when we look at these verse references, it's not like we're going to learn something profound from them. It's just this textbook pointing out the manners and the customs, right, in the Bible. Okay, kind of the idea of the day, or the culture customs of the day. So sometimes we'll just read a verse and don't expect anything profound to be said. Just we're looking at an example in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3, Paul says here, but I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And that, I mean, you could look at that too as being the order of the family as well. All right. Let's look at what he said to Timothy there. 1 Timothy 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 13 through 14. For Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. And then verse 15, that's a reference for later on, just a couple paragraphs later. where it talks about motherhood. So important was motherhood that a woman's position was literally saved through childbirth. And then it's 1 Timothy 2:15. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. Okay, any questions or comments on what we've looked at so far? Okay. Some of the pictures that we've seen so far, back on page 54, we have Bedouin camel riders in the Sinai Desert. Abraham and his heirs were sheiks. Right, that's a very modern picture right there. So, still living the same ways as they did in the Bible, many people. Right, and then on page 55, we got a picture there, woman's area of a Bedouin tent. Male strangers were not permitted in this zone.
You already can tell that in last chapter.
Okay. Page 56. Slaves. In settled times, it was possible for the wealthier families to increase their size by the acquisition of slaves. Most had been captured in wartime or purchased from slave markets. Hosea bought his wife back again from a slave market. That's there at the beginning of Hosea. Although such slaves were regarded as property, they were carefully protected by the law. Okay, there are laws that were given by God, all right, to prevent the mistreatment of slaves. And a lot of times when we think of, well, we're going to get into it. They could not be oppressed, Deuteronomy 23:15-16, and they had the right to Sabbath rest and to attend national festivals. Slaves were often very well treated as if members of the family. If they were circumcised, they enjoyed most of the privileges of Jewish society, except that they could not acquire property or marry foreign slaves. Good treatment was not solely a Jewish characteristic. Naaman's wife's slave was well treated, and so apparently was the Roman slave Onesimus, even at a time when Roman law made escape by a slave to be a capital offense, as in Philemon 17. That's a very good read there. It was possible for a Jew to become a slave so as to repay money owed through debt or theft, or even because he found greater security in another man's house than his own. Okay, so if a Jew, he could sell himself into slavery to repay a debt or to settle one, and then it says there, or even because he found greater security in another man's household. Okay, that wasn't uncommon, for people to sell themselves into slavery. Families and children could be sold in this way. There are some examples there we'll look at here in a minute. Such a person would normally sell his labor for 7 years unless he wanted to stay as one of the family, in which case his ear was ceremoniously pinned to the doorpost, pinned by a nail.
Like,
His ear,
so like they put a nail through his ear and nailed him to the door?
the doorpost. That was it says ceremonially pinned. Okay, we'll look at that. It's Deuteronomy 15. We'll go ahead and look at it now while it's on our mind. Deuteronomy 15. Verse 12. Okay. And if thy brother, an Hebrew man or an Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee, and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year thou shalt let him go free from thee. And when thou sendest him out free from thee, thou shalt not let him go away empty. Thou shalt furnish him liberally out of thy flock, and out of thy floor, and out of thy winepress. Of that wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give unto him. And thou shalt remember, what is it? Woman, use my mouse. And it shall be, verse 15. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee. Therefore I command thee this thing today. And it shall be, if he say unto thee, I will not go away from thee, because he loveth thee in thine house, because he is well with thee, then thou shalt take an awl, and thrust it through his ear into the door, and he shall be thy servant forever. And also unto thy maidservant thou shalt do likewise. And then verse 18. It shall not seem hard unto thee, when thou sendest him away free from thee, for he hath been worth a double hired servant to thee, in serving thee 6 years. And the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all that thou doest. And so there were cases where someone who had sold themselves or been sold to a family, it says for 7 years, okay, in that 7th year they're to be set free. All right, but if at some point or at one point during that service period of servitude, he may have developed a very close bond with the family and wanted to stay as a servant in the family. Now, you think about that. Why would someone want to do that? They most definitely would not have been having been mistreated, right? Because, like what was said back in the beginning of this section here, although such slaves were regarded as property, they were carefully protected by the law. They could not be oppressed, and they had the right to Sabbath rest and to attend national festivals. So they had certain liberties, okay? But they weren't to be mistreated and not oppressed, okay? That is, totally different from the modern ideal, not ideal, that's not the right word, the idea or reasoning behind slavery, even in our own nation's history, okay? But he would have fallen in love with the family, wanted to stay, and it could have been back here earlier in that paragraph, maybe it was because he found greater security in his master's house than in the house of his family. So, in which case his ear was ceremoniously pinned to the doorpost.
They cut it off?
Well, so from the Hebrew word, it's like marseille or something like that, but it translates to needle. So that seems more like understandable than a needle.
I'm trying to figure out, did he cut his ear off?
No.
Well, that's not what it says here in the text.
So he's just pinning his ear a long way on his body.
Yeah. Saying he's stuck to this house forever, basically.
That's what.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Or to the family
Yeah.
that lives there.
So they gave him a piercing.
Basically, they stuck him to the house, to the people.
Thou shalt take
And
an awl
then they
and
took it
thrust it through his ear into the door, and he shall be thy servant forever. So would have taken his ear, pressed it into the doorpost, and taken that awl. Do y'all know what an awl is?
Oh, A-U-L, what is that?
AUL, okay, so you use it to, to punch a hole into it's a leather working tool. People use it in woodworking too. But you would have used that to drive his nail or his ear into the doorpost. Right. And it was a ceremony, okay, and he was into the doorpost being pinned to, he would stay with the family.
How long was he pinned there?
I don't think it would have been long, at least for the duration of this ceremony, which I don't think would have lasted more than, I don't know, a
20,
minute,
30 minutes.
maybe. Just
Just
gather the
period of
family
time.
and,
just doing this ceremony.
Yeah.
You are now with us forever.
I might try to find a video on that
Yeah, I was
here in the
thinking
next break. Hopefully it won't be too graphic like what Brother BJ showed us
Oh
with
my
the
God.
lancing.
Can't
The cyst.
do that.
Yeah.
Alright, some slaves were entrusted with great authority by their masters. Eleazar was responsible for finding a wife for his master's son. A master's daughter could marry a slave, but if the son-in-law decided that he wanted to leave the family after all, he had to leave his wife and children behind. Normally, slaves were set free in the year of Jubilee to return to their inheritance, which was freed at the same time. So if you sold yourself into slavery, or you were a slave, you were freed at the year of Jubilee. So if you had been a Jew who had sold yourself into slavery, you may have done so because you would have to maybe sell your inheritance or your land, and you needed, down on your luck, all right? And at that year of Jubilee, you would have been freed, and you also would have had your land returned back to you. Slaves could be freed at any time if the debt they owed was paid by another member of their family or even themselves. Only girls sold as maid servants remained bound for life. The generous the generous Israelite rules towards slaves contrasted strongly with the harsh laws towards slaves in other areas of the Middle East. The economies of the Greek and Roman empires were largely built upon slavery. The New Testament accepted slavery as a fact of life, but it laid down the doctrinal foundations that would finally bring slavery to an end. And that verse is Galatians 3:28. A different form of slavery was known in Israel, servitude or taxation by labor. Levies were taken by the authorities for so many months of the year for public work purposes. The original Canaanite population that survived the conquest was put to work in this way, but the Israelites had to work for 3 months of the year too. Okay, I want to look at these New Testament references there. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 8. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 8. Knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. Colossians 3:22. So, like what's being mentioned there, it was accepted that, slavery was a part of life, and so it didn't matter whether you were bond or free. Whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord. All right, and then Colossians, if anybody wants to read that, if they're there, they can. Colossians 3:22.
Servants, obey in all things your master according to the flesh, not with eye serving and as
Men pleasers.
men please, but in the singleness of heart, fearing God.
Fearing God. The reason you'd want to obey, right, is you were fearful of God's judgment, chastisement, and the same for masters. Bosses. They surely wouldn't want to mistreat their servants, slaves, because the Lord he keeps an account of those things. Okay. There was one more there I wanted to look at. There's that Philemon 16, which is that's a good read. It's just one chapter there. One of those is hard to find because usually it's on half a page like mine is. All right. Philemon 16. Not now as a servant, but above a servant, a brother beloved, especially to me, but how much more unto thee, both in the flesh and in the Lord. This is Paul's advice to Philemon about Onesimus, but above a servant, a brother beloved, especially to me. Even though he was a slave, he was a beloved brother, especially to me, is what Paul says. All right, then this Galatians 3:28. This is a really good verse here. Galatians 3, verse 28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. Amen. All right. Any questions? Okay. Let's look here. The blue box over here. The name of God, Yahweh or Jah or Yah, was often incorporated into personal names. Abijah means God is his father. Elijah means my God is Yahweh. Jonathan means gift of Yahweh. Other names remind people of birth. Moses means drawn forth because he was taken from the river Nile. Got a joke for y'all. All right. Who was the best financial? No, let me rephrase that. The joke always bombs when you forget how to phrase the question. Let's see. Who was the best financier? Right, you understand what I'm asking about that? Okay. Well, let me look for another word, and then I'll give y'all the joke. Okay. Sorry. Okay. All right. Above, on page 57, a Roman slave medallion. The Greeks and Roman empires were largely built upon slavery. Okay. Rites of passage. Within the family, there were 4 great occasions that marked the progress of life. Okay, note these. All right, this is on the test. All right, the 4 great occasions that marked the progress of life: birth, maturity, marriage, and death. Because of their importance, such occasions were often marked with special social customs. However, when people believe that God is involved in the process of life, these events take on a religious significance, and religious rites are performed alongside the social ones. These are known as rites of passage. Okay. Okay, yeah, we are going to look at those. All right. Children. Because parents believed that they lived on in their children, children were looked upon as a great blessing. Mark that as well. Children were looked upon as a great blessing. The more children a person could have, the better it was. Psalm 127, verse 5, first part says, "Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them." If a woman could not have children, it was therefore seen as a curse from God because it was as good as extinction. Rachel told Jacob that if she had no children, she would die. Hannah believed her childlessness was God's punishment, and Elizabeth knew the reproachful look she received from people because they believed she had done something to upset God. When John was born, she knew that the Lord had taken away my disgrace. A cause for joy, though all babies were, boys were the real blessing. Men stayed with the family and so increased its size and wealth with wives and more children. Girls, on the other hand, were valuable only for the work they could do while they were young and for the bride price that would be paid as a form of compensation when they moved to another family. Now, I know the way that it's worded seems really harsh, but that was the custom. Well, I say the custom of that day. It's still the custom in some parts of the world. But so men, they would stay within the family, and of course this family would increase even more when he would marry and have children. And then girls, they were valuable for the time they were young and would be working around the house, and then for the bride price they would fetch. Okay. Birth. The expectant mother was not to take a hot bath in case it led to a miscarriage, and there were certain things she could not eat: green vegetables, salt food, and fat, in case they affected the unborn child. The local midwife assisted in the birth, which normally took place at home. That's also something I would probably note. Birth took place at home. There might have been a doctor, but he would have been running his practice most likely out of his own house. But families, they had midwives, or there were local midwives that would come and around the time of birth so they could assist, and it was all done at home. And that's something that has remained for a long time until you saw clinics and hospitals become a common thing. Homes that were built had birthing rooms. That's where the births would take place. Okay. The newborn baby was washed and then had salt rubbed over the skin in the belief that this hardened it. The Jewish mother believed that the limbs would grow straight and firm if they were bound tightly to the sides by what were called swaddling clothes. These were bandages 4 or 5 inches wide and 5 or 6 yards long. All right, any questions on any of that? Okay. Circumcision. It's always an uncomfortable one to talk about. 8 days after the birth, the male baby was circumcised, either by the head of the family or by a physician. The blessing was said, "Blessed be the Lord our God, who has sanctified us by his precepts and has given us circumcision." There was normally some kind of family celebration during the 8 days between birth and circumcision. It's difficult to know what circumcision first meant. Before it was taken on by the Jews, it was probably some kind of initiation rite in which a young man's vigor and sexuality were dedicated to his God. God then took the celebration and gave it to the Jews as a sign that the whole nation was dedicated to him from the outset. Of course, when he gave it to the Jews, Abraham was no baby. Okay, when he had to circumcise himself, and he was an old man. Yeah. Okay. I would note the first sentence or first little part there, 8 days. All right, that's when the circumcision took place after birth. 8 days after birth of the male baby, of course. Okay, Jesus' childhood, the blue box there. Mary and Joseph had Jesus circumcised on the 8th day. At the end of 40 days, they went up to Jerusalem, about 4 miles from Bethlehem, to offer the required sacrifices and to pay the redemption money. It is clear that Mary and Joseph were extremely poor because they could afford only 2 birds. Immediately after this, they returned to Nazareth with Jesus. If the wise men arrived at the time when Jesus was approximately 2 years old, then the wise men could have gone to Nazareth. The richness of the gifts, which had great symbolic value, must have been a fortune to Mary and Joseph. The gifts might have enabled them to set up a carpentry business and to look after Jesus and later a larger family. Yeah, that is kind of a common misconception there about when the wise men appeared, visited Jesus. He was likely 2 years old or around that age, a toddler, rather than a baby. I guess 2 years old could be considered a toddler. He wasn't, they didn't arrive on the night of the birth, but they were there more than likely at around 2 years old when Jesus was 2 years old. Okay, let's take a break, a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and finish out the chapter. Oof. That's a lot longer than I thought. We'll finish it though. All right, online students, I'll make sure and take you a break as well. Keep your mind fresh. Okay, we're back. I found an article during our break. It's on the website One for Israel, and I actually follow this page. It's a really good page. It's about reaching Jews for Christ, and I was introduced to this page. I heard a testimony of a woman who was introduced. She found Jesus. She was a Jew, and she became a Christian. And we might watch that video at another time of her testimony. But I typed in Jewish slaves ear piercing. I can't remember exactly what I typed in, but this was one of the articles that popped up, and I recognized the source, the website. So I clicked on it, and it is really good. All right. So why did bond slaves have their ear pierced? There was a song we used to sing about God piercing our ears as a mark of willingly becoming a bond slave, according to the process laid out in Deuteronomy 15. At the time, I was going through a protracted debate with my parents, who felt I was not old enough for pierced ears. So I really liked that song and sang it defiantly. I did not understand it then, but that particular part of the Torah was not about jewelry. The meaning of this ear-piercing ritual that God outlines in the law is much more profound than I could possibly have imagined. The instructions for making a regular slave into a bond slave are laid out twice in the Torah, Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15. As a rabbi once pointed out to me, it is highly interesting that right after the Ten Commandments is when God launches into his law. This is the very first thing he says. And we read this, I don't know if we read this earlier, but Exodus 21, 1 through 6. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out free for nothing. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be a slave forever. Okay, that's, kind of paraphrased a little bit there. But it's the gist of what is said there. Right after the dramatic exodus from slavery in Egypt, God tells them that the first thing you should know about slaves is that they should go free for nothing. That the Hebrew people should not be indefinitely enslaved, but offered the chance to go free after a limited time of service. After that, the slave might choose to stay out of love for the master, but that should be a matter of free choice. Deuteronomy 15 reiterates the principle, okay, and there's that. Deuteronomy 15 verses 12 through 17, all right? Then the questions that, I kind of had as well. Why piercing? Why a door? And why an ear? It does seem a slightly strange ceremony, doesn't it? But as is so often the case with the Bible, if you scratch a little beneath the surface, there are all manner of truth treasures to be found. It's a matter of asking the right questions and steady observation. All right, so take the principal ideas to start with. Nails driven through flesh. Blood on door frames. Permanent piercing with holes and scars forever. Does it sound at all familiar? If you're starting to see the parallels, good. All right, so why piercing? The process was this. The slave who, for the reason of love, wished to serve his master voluntarily would be taken to a door frame. Then a martsiah, something that is used to bore a hole. The word is only used in these two descriptions in the Bible. Would pierce or bore a hole through the skin of the earlobe, marking the flesh permanently. Paul says in Galatians, I carry the scars of Jesus on my own body. The word for scar is stigma. Here is Strong's definition. From a primary, stizo, to stick or to prick, a mark incised or punched for recognition of ownership. All right, so figuratively, a scar of service or a mark is what Paul is giving their description of. All right, the description continues, a mark pricked in or branded upon the body. To ancient Oriental usage, slaves and soldiers bore the name of or the stamp of their master or commander, branded or pricked or cut into their bodies to indicate what master or general they belonged to. And there are even some devotees who stamp themselves in this way with the token of their gods. All right, but here, Paul is talking about scars, marks, stigmas in his own body that mark him out as a bond slave to Yeshua, Christ. But Yeshua also has permanent scars. His scars also come about from having his flesh pierced on wood as a result of love and willing submission to serve. Of course, his words, not my will, but yours. He said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Yeshua is the ultimate servant whose glorious scars, all other scars can only be a shadow of. He still has scars on his hands to this day and forever, a permanent mark of his great love and willing servanthood, far beyond any conceivable call of duty. So why piercing is what we just answered and looked at there. Now, why a door? The concept of bringing your servant to a door in order to carry out the whole operation is also quite interesting. The New Testament word for door appears 39 times and is a fascinating study in itself. Yeshua, Christ, says twice, I am the door, in John 10. Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. And again, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. A door is a passageway. Okay. That's pretty clear. A portal. It presents an opportunity to move from one environment to another. Isn't that exactly what all of this is about? As a metaphor, a door can be used to signify opportunity, and the door of the kingdom of heaven is said to denote the conditions which must be complied with in order to be received into the kingdom of God. All right. When we think of door frames in the Bible, our mind is whisked back to the Exodus story itself, a pivotal moment in Israel's history. The moment when the Israelites were liberated from forced slavery and were delivered into freedom, where they willingly entered into a covenant with their God to follow His commandments. Blood on the doorframe is one of the most iconic images of this transfer from slavery into following a new master and freedom. The blood of the Messiah from His pierced flesh on the cross, the blood of the Passover lamb on the lintels, and the blood of the slave who for love agrees to serve his master willingly. So you kind of see the parallel between all of that. Crossing over the threshold through the door must be voluntary. And Yeshua, Christ, presents us with that opportunity. He is that portal. He is the door to the kingdom of heaven. It is no accident or mere matter of convenience that the servant is brought to a door for this ritual. And in why ears? Right? We find that earlobes also feature in two other significant places in the Torah, in the consecration of priests and the cleansing of lepers. Okay? So in this text here, Leviticus 14:1-4, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of cleansing, of his cleansing. The priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds, and cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. Scarlet yarn, like the color of blood, and hyssop, like they used to paint the blood on the door frames on the Passover night. All right, that's what they used when they applied the blood to the door frames the night of the death angel, the 10th plague. And then it continues on talking about the priest. All right, so priests are made holy by their ears, thumbs, and big toes being made holy with blood from the sacrifice. And then leprosy, a picture of sin in the Bible, cleansed and atoned for by blood applied to the same places, followed by anointing oil applied on top. All right, so our hands signify our deeds, our feet represent our walk, and our ears signify obediently hearing and obeying our Lord. It is a double picture of a life thoroughly cleansed and consecrated to God. Sin is atoned for, and the body is ready for service, ear to the throne, ever ready to hear God's bidding and carry it out. The Apostle Paul regularly, himself a bondservant of Yeshua, Christ, using the Greek word doulos, which means a slave, bondservant, one in a servile condition, and we would do well as those redeemed from sin and consecrated as priests to see ourselves in the same way. When you hear those text words translated out, servant, okay, that's not the wrong idea that's being presented by using that word, but the word there in many places is doulos, which means slave, okay? And if you think about it, we are slaves to Christ, okay? Now, He is the great master, okay? We're not going to be mistreated, all right, anything like that. But that's the idea there. We've been bought by the blood of the Lamb, okay? And another thing, our service to Him, even though we've been bought, is willing, okay? Even once we're saved, we can choose not to live for the Lord or to live for Him, okay? Now, I do kind of question somebody who gets saved and then they never even take any steps toward living to the Lord. Okay, where's the proof? Okay, but like I often point out though too, I don't know somebody's heart, and a lot of times people go right back into the environment that they were in before they were saved, and they get right back to it. But living for the Lord is a good mark, good proof that someone is saved. But anyway, that's a good read. One for Israel is the website, and it's Why Did Bond Slaves Have Their Ear Pierced? Okay.
Ain't got no video on it?
No, I didn't find a video.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I figured, what we would see is, just someone getting an ice pick drove through their ear. Because that's basically what I will pull that up. What is an awl?
Is it like a leather punch?
That's what I'm thinking. It is like this right here, like an ice pick.
Yeah.
They better clean them things before they drive it through my ear. That's basically what it is. I got one of those at the church. It's an ice pick. But
It's just another name for ice pick on.
pretty much, yeah. All right. Naming, page 59. The naming of the child frequently accompanied the act of circumcision. So at the time that they were circumcised is the same time they would be named. Names normally had some kind of significance in the family, and it is interesting to follow through the meanings where they are given in the margin of the Bible. So important was the birth and the naming that parents' names were often changed. Father became father of whoever, and mother became mother of whoever. So that's, once they had kids, all right, they were still Abraham, but now he was Abraham, son of Abraham. A lot of times in the Bible, when it talks about the God, it says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Isaac was his son. So he became known as the father of Isaac. And so that was a title he earned.
Well, yeah, I knew that.
That's out of
When you said Abraham, son of, I was like,
Now who's
who is
Oh,
his father?
okay, yeah, I misphrased that there. Father of. All right, my bad. I'm drawing a blank.
Come from somewhere.
He came from Ur of the Chaldees. All right. Did I? Okay, I did press record.
Tara.
Oh, Tara.
Tara.
Yeah.
Tara. That's right.
All right, very good. All right. After the birth, the mother stayed at home 7 days for a boy and 14 for a girl. 33 days later, all right, 66 in the case of a baby girl, she was ready to make the customary offerings. Normally, a lamb with a pigeon or dove were offered as a sin offering to restore a woman's fellowship with God. In case of poverty, another pigeon or dove could be substituted for the lamb. The sin offering seems to have indicated that the woman had been ritually unclean, and she was during menstruation. The ritual uncleanness was not actual defilement through childbirth, but it was a means of protecting a woman from sexual relations in times of weakness and possible embarrassment. In the case of a firstborn child, redemption money of 5 shekels had to be paid because, since the preservation of the Jewish firstborn at the original Passover, all firstborn children belonged to God. Babies were normally breastfed by the mother, or if necessary by a wet nurse, and this often went on for several years. The day the child was weaned called for a celebration. I'd imagine so.
Got teeth.
Yeah. All right, now back on page 59, there's a Jewish male baby is circumcised. Now, I'll be honest, I never really liked this picture because of the dude right there in the middle.
Yeah, looking at us.
Yeah, he's got kind of a weird look on his face, but it was a time of celebration. It was a happy occasion. The child was being circumcised. That's part of their covenant with God. And then also he would be named. And especially it was a joyous celebration if it was the firstborn. Okay, page 60, entering manhood. The Jewish boy was recognized as entering manhood at 13 years of age, but it is not certain when this practice began. By New Testament times, a boy of 13 became a son of the law. The significance of the account of Jesus being left behind at the temple is that it showed he was leaving his childhood. It was the last time he would attend Passover as a child. Only after age 13 did the child qualify to become one of the 10 men who could constitute a synagogue. It took 10 men, all right, for a synagogue to be begun or started in a village or a city. So a Jewish boy here on page 60 of the picture, a Jewish boy at his bar mitzvah at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. This religious ceremony marks his arrival at adulthood. Notice the prayer shawl and the mezuzah on the rabbi's forehead. That's they wear that on their forehead and on their hands, their wrists, as a sign of where they are to keep the Lord's law, all right, and also to know it. So that's the picture there. And then of course the boy, he's got it on top of his head there.
Yeah, how they kept that in place?
I think there's a little band in
Is it a
there.
band?
Yeah.
Uh,
All right. Polygamy. Although marriage was allowed with more than one woman simultaneously, as when Jacob married Leah and Rachel and had sexual relationships with their servants, polygamy was not common in Israel in biblical times. One reason was that a husband had to be quite wealthy to be able to afford more than one wife. Therefore, it tended to be royalty who had many wives. David had many, including Michal, Abigail, and Bathsheba. And Solomon had still more during the wealthiest part of his kingship. Yeah, he had a lot. Hundreds. The high priest could have only one wife, and other leading figures of the Old Testament were monogamous. Noah, Isaac, Joseph, and Moses. It was often pointed out by the rabbis that more than one wife led to problems. And yeah, that's clear in scriptures where it occurs. Leah and Rachel in Genesis 30, and then Hannah and Peninnah in 1 Samuel 1. It's Hannah, the mother of Solomon. Not Solomon, Samuel. All right. I would note, and I think I've already mentioned it maybe, polygamy was not common in Israel in biblical times, right? It happened, but it was not the standard. And I think I told y'all to I feel like I told y'all to mark something similar to that. Okay. It happened, but it wasn't the ideal situation. All right, arranged marriage. Young people did not normally decide whom they would marry. It was marriage first and love afterwards. Although there was therefore a great deal more will than romance, it tended to produce a stable pattern of marriages. Esau was in trouble because he married contrary to the wishes of his parents. The practice of arranging marriages did not mean that parents did not consider the feelings of their children, or that love did not sometimes happen before marriage. A friend who attends the bridegroom negotiated on behalf of the prospective bridegroom and his father with a representative of the bride's father. Arrangements had to be made for work compensation to be paid to the woman's family, and a dowry had to be paid to the bride's father. He could use the interest from the dowry, but could not spend it because it was to be kept in trust for the wife in case she was ever widowed or divorced. Where such sums of money could not be paid because of the poverty of the suitor, other means were found instead, such as service or elimination of enemies. So, if you couldn't pay the dowry, you could either serve, right, which is the case drawing a blank there. With Jacob, with Leah and Rachel, he worked for Rachel and kind of got the old bait and switch there, and then he worked again for got Leah, and then he worked again for Rachel. Or you could, I guess in essence, be given a hit to take out some of the family's enemies.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And I'd never really known that until I read this book, took this class. All right. It became a custom that part of the dowry should form a circlet of coins that were attached to the woman's headdress. They became a symbol like a wedding ring, and therefore the loss of such a coin, as is talked about there in Luke chapter 15, would be the cause of a great deal of anxiety. As part of the marriage agreement, the bride's father would make a marriage gift dowry to his daughter. Okay, so I don't see any here in the picture that's given here, but perhaps, or there may be one
On the next page.
on the next page. Yeah, you can kind of see coins there, maybe not on her head dress or her headwear, but kind of around her neck. It looks like some coins there possibly. But if you had something like that, you probably wouldn't need coins, all the precious metal there. Kind of on this page here, a couple pages after, it's kind of like what she, you can kind of see like there on her forehead, those, we'll just say those are coins, because that's what would be made out of the coins. So it was part of the dowry that would be used to make that. So there in Luke chapter 15, where the woman who loses a coin there, she is, trying to find that coin because it's part of her dowry, part of her headdress. Okay, marriages were arranged, if possible, with members of one's own kin. Abraham sent a servant to find a bride for Isaac from his own people, and Jacob was sent to the same place to find a wife. Samson's parents were upset because Samson had not chosen a wife from his own clan. Marriages sometimes took place outside the clan, such as with Ruth, and Genesis 41:45. I wonder what that reference is. We'll look at that. Genesis 41, verse 45. It says, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, and Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Okay, so Joseph there was given a wife, an Egyptian wife by Pharaoh. That's what's being talked about there. Okay. Marriages sometimes took place outside the clan, and this usually happened for political reasons. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, it was never approved, however, because people from other clans worshiped different deities, and this affected the whole religious life of the people. Close marriages within the family were forbidden. The laws forbidding marriages between close relatives are set out in Leviticus 18, verses 6 through 18. Okay, so they married within the family, but more so in the sense of the clan. So, extended family, removed several times. Okay, you wouldn't see siblings marrying or first cousins or anything like that. All right, those are close marriages within the family, and they were forbidden. Okay. Betrothal. Once the arrangement to marry was entered into, there was a betrothal that was more binding than the engagement in contemporary society. A man who was betrothed to a woman, even though not yet married, was exempted from military service. If a girl was already betrothed and was raped by another man, she could not become that other man's wife, as would normally be the case. And that's because she already belonged to her husband-to-be. Now, such violation involved the death penalty. The formal words of the betrothal were probably those spoken by Saul when Michal and David were betrothed. 1 Samuel 18:22, you shall be my son-in-law. The betrothal could be broken only by a legal transaction, in effect a divorce, and the ground for such termination was adultery. All right, so the grounds for divorce was adultery. I would note that. Betrothal lasted for about 12 months, during which the home was to be prepared by the groom and the wedding clothes would be prepared by the bride. The bride's family would prepare for the wedding festivities. Mary and Joseph were betrothed when it was found that she was pregnant. Joseph did not want to expose her publicly because, as a supposed adulteress, Mary would have been stoned to death. It must have taken a great deal of love for Mary and a great deal of trust in God, speaking through his dream, that enabled Joseph to marry her. Maybe this is a reflection of the character of God looked for in the man who was to bring up Jesus. In New Testament times, a man such as Joseph became formally betrothed when he gave a present to the girl and said, "By this thou art set apart for me according to the laws of Moses and of Israel." Yeah.
What do betrothal real?
It's,
Like engaged.
yeah, it's kind of like they're engaged, but it's a lot more, nowadays, you get engaged, something happens, it can be called off as easily, it's just giving the ring back or just saying it's over. But back then, betrothal was a lot more serious and it meant commitment. It meant commitment, yeah. But yeah, real.
Ain't that like?
But, one thing that also could be pointed out, it talks about how, whenever you talk about arranged marriages, it's always looked down upon. But, in many cases, the arranged marriages worked out better than those that were, entered into out of desire or lust. But, it does say back on page 61, the practice of arranging marriages did not mean the parents did not consider the feelings of their children, or that love did not sometimes happen before marriage. That's kind of the thing if, there was no love in arranged marriages, and that wasn't always the case. That it could happen as time went on, or even before the marriage. All right, the wedding. There were several important parts to the wedding itself. The wedding was essentially non-religious, apart from a blessing that was pronounced over the couple. Something that would have been said, "Our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the gates of their enemies." The marriage involved the drawing up of and the acceptance of a legal contract. This is still true of a Jewish wedding today. It may shock some Christians to realize that it was not until the comparatively recent times that a rabbi or priest was required to be present at a wedding. So, very much the case, there would be no rabbi or priest at the wedding. The wedding also involved dressing up. The bride was literally adorned like a queen. She was bathed and her hair braided with as many precious stones as the family possessed or could borrow. The girls who had dressed her accompanied her as companions. The bridegroom, too, was dressed in finery and jewelry, and was accompanied by the friend of the bridegroom. The dressing up for the wedding was so important that it was unforgettable. The bride and groom looked like and acted like a king and queen. Another important element of the wedding was the procession at the end of the day. The bridegroom set out from his home to fetch his bride from her parents' home. At this point, the bride and groom entered under a canopy when they arrived at the house. There they presided over the wedding feast, at which a great deal of time was spent in eating and drinking. At the wedding in Cana, Jesus provided 120 gallons of wine for the guests, but they had already drunk so much that the person in charge, who was referred to as ruler of the feast, thought it was a pity that the excellent new wine should have been left to the end when people could not appreciate it. Okay. Festivities often lasted for 7 days, or perhaps even longer. The guests were there to witness that the marriage had been consummated. The blood-stained bed coverings were shown to demonstrate that the bride had been a virgin. The veil does not seem to have been removed from Leah's face until after the marriage was consummated. Jacob did not know it was Leah until the light of day. During the festivities, God's blessing was asked upon the couple, and it may well have been for this reason that Jesus was invited to the wedding at Cana to provide the blessing over the couple. In very wealthy families, guests were actually provided with wedding clothes.
So it goes from 63 to
Yep.
66.
My bad. Page 63. Another important element of the wedding was a procession at the end of the day. The bridegroom set out from his home to fetch his bride from her parents' home. At this point, the bride was wearing a veil. At some point, the veil was taken off and laid on the shoulder of the bridegroom, and the declaration was made, "The government shall be upon his shoulder." A procession then set out from the bride's home to the couple's new home, and the dark roadway would be lit with oil lamps held by wedding guests. In the story told by Jesus, the bride and groom were later than expected, so the oil in the lamps began to run low. Only those who had brought a reserve flask of oil were able to refill their lamps and welcome the bride and groom. There was singing and music along the way, and sometimes the bride herself would join in the dance. Okay. What we read on this page right here was talking about the wedding feast. Okay. The procession that they're accompanying that illustration there. On the marriage day, there was a procession. The bridegroom, dressed in his best clothes and decorated with jewels, walked with his friends from his home to his bride's home. She would be waiting, having dressed after being bathed by her bridesmaids. She wore a veil to cover her face. I still laugh when I think of Jacob and Leah. That still always kind of makes me laugh. Waking up, you're not Rachel. Whoops. All right, divorce. Marriages could and did break up, and it was possible for a man to divorce his wife if he could find something indecent about her. Jewish lawyers interpreted this phrase in different ways. In the time of Jesus, the followers of Shammai believed it referred to adultery or sexual misconduct. The followers of Hillel believed that the phrase could include even the spoiling of a dinner. So, sorry, hun, the dinner tonight just missed, so you're out of here. And that's not over exaggerating. That's for real. In society of that time, it was possible for a man simply to tell a woman that she was divorced, but the Jews were required to give a written bill of divorcement that contradicted the original marriage contract. Part of the bill or writ of divorcement allowed the woman to remarry, but a girl who had married a man because she had previously been raped by the man could not be divorced at all. A man who had falsely accused his wife of not being a virgin when they were married also could not divorce her. If a divorced wife remarried and her new husband died or divorced her, the original husband could not remarry her. But if she had not remarried, her first husband could remarry her. Okay. God's people were left in no doubt that divorce was unacceptable to God, and Jesus reiterated that whom God had joined together, no one was to separate. Women were not allowed to initiate divorce. And of course, as times have changed, so too have these practices in parts of the world, but in this area, in Bible areas where all this takes place, it's still very much the case in some places. But one of my favorite stories when looking at, marriage is Hosea. I love the book of Hosea. And, it's exactly how the Lord's relationship with Israel went to. They were all the time, being unfaithful to him. And yet he still loved them. They were still his people. Now, he chastised them, okay, allowed them to go through some really tough things, but never abandoned them. And it's the same thing with Hosea. His wife put him and his children, 2 of his children might not have even been his, but yet he still went and paid the price for her freedom. I really like the book of Hosea. The wonders of redeeming love. Okay, death. A man's life was complete when he was 70. So if you made it to 70, you lived a complete life. Most people died before this, but there were some notable exceptions. Death was, especially when you look in the early, parts of Genesis, how long those folks were living. Death was the final event for which there were rites of passage. So what we've been going over, okay, birth, maturity, marriage, and now death, these are the events in life that carried rites of passage. Okay, that's what we've kind of been talking about, going all the way back to page 59, I believe. No, all the way back to page 57. And now we're ending it with death. All right, so there was no assurance of life after death in early Israelite history. Parents were believed to be able to live on in their children, so that the writer to the Hebrews is able to say that when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, Levi was already in Abraham, because Levi was a descendant of Abraham. Levi therefore paid tithes to the Jerusalem king, and his priesthood was thereby judged to be inferior. Okay, people believed that they were gathered to an underworld, Sheol, where people were shades or shadows of their past. Not until the time of Daniel was there revelation that a resurrection would occur, some to eternal life and some to eternal punishment. Nothing became entirely clear until Jesus had opened the kingdom of heaven to all believers and became the first fruits of those who have fallen. Not only does the New Testament have to explain this to contemporary Christians, but those outside the Christian faith were of all men most miserable because their hopes were limited to this life alone. Immediately when a person died, there was a time of wailing and lamentation. I would make a note of that. The wail was an announcement to the neighborhood that a death had taken place. And I was about to reference this, but it's in the next sentence. The Egyptians had so many dead on the occasion of the first Passover that the wail could be heard through the whole country. That's what the death angel passes over those with the blood on their doors. The family then gathered for lamentation, a time for a great show of weeping, almost as if those who were still alive wanted to impress the shade of the dead person that they were really sorry, that they were really sad that they were gone. Micah says that it sounded like jackals and owls. And Jesus was aware of it when he went to raise Jairus' daughter at the Capernaum synagogue. David's expressions of grief for Absalom were typical. Wealthy families would hire groups of professional mourners who would add to the noise. I remember when I took ancient history in 8th grade. No, 7th grade. Middle school. Okay, one of those grades. And we studied ancient Egypt and, this time period. And he said that for some religions, the more people you had there grieving your loss, grieving you, now that you're in the afterlife, the more likely you were to make it to paradise or whatever belief in the afterlife that certain religion had. But so that's why they would hire and bring in professional mourners, so that, had a better chance of making it to the good place after death.
What do you do for a living? Oh, okay. Brian Hollis.
I mean, there are some people that do that on social media. They're just actors. Goat's hair cloth garments, or sackcloth, we know that, were worn so as to cause discomfort. The breast was beaten and clothes were torn to demonstrate how grief-stricken people were. Which more we got? Okay, we'll make it. All right, any questions so far? I know we've covered a lot since I last asked. Okay, burial. Burial had to take place quickly because the hot climate led to rapid decomposition. However, a burial never took place on a Sabbath or holy day. The body was normally washed, wrapped loosely in a linen cloth, and carried to the burial place on a wooden stretcher. Luke 7:14, where the stretcher or coffin was used for a sick man. Okay, so I guess what they're saying is what the sick man was being carried on was what dead bodies would have been carried on. Burial could take place in a natural cave or in an artificially made one, a sepulcher. Natural caves were widened and provided with niches, I don't know how that's pronounced, or shelves. Shelves where the bodies could be laid to rest. Because there were limited numbers of caves, when the bodies had decomposed, the bones were removed and put into stone jars called ossuaries. These jars were stored in the corner, and the niches were made available for further burials. The mouth of the tomb was sealed either with a disc-shaped stone that ran in an inclined groove in front of the cave, or with a boulder that fell into the access hole beneath it. Either way, the stone was extremely difficult to move once it was in place. Burial caves and sepulchres were painted white as a warning to the living that the dead were there. A living person could not always worship God after having had contact with the dead. I guess maybe being considered unclean. Alternatively, burial was effected by laying the stretcher on the ground and surrounding the body with boulders about 18 inches in diameter and a rough oblong. Okay. I guess that's burying someone under a heap of stones. And then the body was then covered by earth, the boulders forming a boundary to the grave. Oh, okay. I think I get what they're saying now. Alright, so our time with Brother Christian. Alright, so they would have, done all their boulders around the wherever the body was laid. Alright, and then they would have filled this area with dirt. The body would have been placed here, maybe a little bit underground. And of course, there's going to be like stones completely surrounding it, and off a bunch of gaps in it. And then they would have covered the body with dirt, or at least that's what I'm getting from the description here. Burial as such was not common because of the hardness of the ground. Alright, so that was not a common burial practice. The simple graveyards were always kept outside a village or town. Only royalty were buried within the city. Exceptionally, a body was covered in spices and in paste, and these were tied to the body by layers of white roller bandage. The paste hardened and impregnated the bandages until a hard preservative, mold, or cocoon was formed about the body. A cap was put on the head, and often the jaw was held in position by a bandage under the chin. This was done for Jesus by two wealthy men following the initial burial in the simple sheet. In Lazarus' case, his hands and feet seem to have been tied together before he was covered with the sheet. His jaw was tied by a bandage. Proper embalmment was carried out in Egypt, where the removal of the internal organs took place. The body was filled with paste, and the organs kept in a jar. Of course, they also mummified bodies as well, which that was part of the process. In Israel, following the burial, there was a funeral meal to conclude the period of mourning, often for a week or longer. Oh, we do the same thing a lot of times. The family gets together and has a meal. It doesn't last that long, but that's part of the rites of, passage, I guess, passing away in this case. A woman who survived her husband was in a very difficult position. She could not inherit from her husband. She could remain in her husband's family if the next of kin would take her in marriage. More often, the widow was without any financial support. The law therefore said that widows were to be protected. In the early church, money was set aside to care for widows because in the society of the day, prostitution was about the only way for women to obtain money to live. Paul expected widows to be supported by their families. The local church was to put the names of widows who had lived good lives and were over age 60 on a charity list. All right. Let's see. All right. We missed a picture back on page 67. Yemenite Jewish women celebrate in the traditional manner at the wedding feast. Page 68. The burial of Jesus. Because Jesus was wrapped in a cocoon, one can understand why it was that the disciples saw and then believed in the resurrection, and why it was that the body had not been stolen. Jesus' body had passed through the cocoon of spice-impregnated bandages, just as it did through the door of the upper room. Looking quickly through the doorway of the tomb, John thought that the body was still there because he could see the cocoon, and therefore he would not enter. Only when John and Peter went in and saw that there was a gap where the face should have been, did they realize what had happened. So the body would be wrapped in these bandages. After time, it would kind of harden, and the only space that wasn't covered was in this area, the face. Right, and they would just lay a napkin or a burial sheet over that. All right. All right. Part of a Hasmonean period coffin discovered during archaeological excavations in Israel. All right. Bereavement. These verses reflect an extreme kind of grief, which was much the same as that felt at time of death. The psalmist wept rivers of water because he knew what would follow the breaking of the law. Page 69, the picture there. This tomb outside Jerusalem, known as the Tomb of the Herods, has a disc-shaped stone as its door, similar to the tomb where Jesus was buried. Okay, and then page 70 are pictures here. At the top, rock-cut catacombs at the Jewish burial site at Bet Sherem, Israel. And then a bone box or ossuary from the time of Jesus. So those are the bones that had the body had decomposed, decayed, and they were removed from one of the niches or the shelves in the wall where the bodies were laid and put in there and then stored in a corner. Okay, any questions? Any comments?
I think I want to do my project on the brides.
Had your or clothes?
Maybe not the shoes. I'll pull that out. Dress and dress, maybe. At least the headdress.
I mean,
I think I can pull it off.
I was thinking you're going to go with like burial clothes or.
No.
The dowry. Is it the dowry?
The dowry is what the father paid.
The groom's father or family would pay the bride's father.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if y'all don't have any questions, all right. Just a reminder: next week we're going to test on chapters 3 and 4. You've got your study guides. I'm going to go after I get a bite for lunch and work on the study guide for chapter 5, what we went over today. And I'll hand those out before y'all leave. Y'all are doing very well. Y'all are doing real good. You're welcome. All right, if y'all don't have any questions or comments, we'll close with the word of prayer. Would any of y'all like to lead us in that?
Oh. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you today thankful for the opportunity to be here and learn more about you and history, Lord. We just ask that you be with all the prayer requests. You know what they are, Lord. We ask for safe travels for everybody when they leave today. The next class, we ask that you just help us to recall to memory what we've learned. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.